Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Orthodox Nationalist. It is the 11th of July, 2018. So I'm 6 days early for the lecture commemorating the 100th anniversary of the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. In my opinion, it's the most significant political event of the 20th century. It changed the world, as anything happening in Russia usually does. Tsar Nicholas was the last Roman emperor. He is, as a monarch was always understood to be, the last line of defense against Antichrist. Not an Antichrist, but the Antichrist. And it's no accident that around the time of his being deposed, now he did not resign. That letter that he wrote was a forgery. It wasn't written in his style. It wasn't on official letterhead. It simply was a forgery that was sent out to the army, and it immediately destroyed their morale, and which was the point of it. What a lot of people don't realize is how many bishops in the Orthodox Church and how many generals in the army were sympathetic with the what we now know as a provisional government, liberalism in general, and who wanted to see the monarchy destroyed. It would make sense that the upper classes, of course, always want to see a monarch destroyed, because a strong monarchy keeps them from power. Tsar Martyr Nicholas, who was canonized in the latter part of the 20th century by all factions of the Russian Church, he was canonized on the grounds that he was a martyr for the faith. He was explicitly sacrificed. Now, the minyan is the Jewish term that refers to essentially a quorum. And it's normally 10. So you have Voloshkin, Yurovsky, Dzerzhinsky, of course, Sverdlov, Shronatov, Vaganov, Safin, Voykov, Nikulin, and Medvedev. That was your minyan. It's commonly stated that, in other words, it was explicitly stated that this was a sacrifice. Because on the wall, written in Hebrew, it said, and I quote here, "Here, on orders from unseen forces, the king was sacrificed to destroy the society. All goyim are hereby notified." And on the walls you had pornographic images of the empress with Rasputin and all kinds of, their propaganda over the last few years up to that point. The leader of this sacrificial cult was Yurovsky, who was very much like Trotsky, a Jewish nationalist. And a lot of these men had only a minimal knowledge of what we call Bolshevism today. They were just thugs. In the Jewish mind, Tsar Nicholas was the Goy king, in essence. He was the leader of all Christendom. He was the leader of essentially the last Christian empire, and certainly the largest and most powerful. Now, we know about World War I. It was brought about by many factors, and primarily British anger and jealousy over the rising might of Germany. The German Navy, around 1910, was equal to the size of the British, and her industrial and financial power were now essentially equal to Great Britain. Russia, too, was a substantial threat because of her massive economic growth, her discovery of oil in Azerbaijan, and her stymieing British growth in Asia. And the imperative from London was to make sure that their two rivals, Russia and Germany, fought against each other. Britain couldn't defeat both of them together, even though Germany and Russia are natural allies. They have a lot in common in terms of the political system, and Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser were first cousins. And of course, they found the weak link in the Balkans. And so World War I began. And whether it be Austria, Germany, or Russia, it wasn't the monarchs that were interested in war. It was the elected parliaments that were into war. They were the ones who were screaming for it. The monarchs, Kaiser Wilhelm and Nicholas, were not particularly enthusiastic about it. Kaiser Wilhelm had told Vienna that, well, he told them a few things. First of all, the Serbs had no particular interest in killing Ferdinand. Ferdinand was very pro-Slavic. He would have been a decent successor, actually. Number two, that the demands that Austria made on Serbia were too extreme, but importantly, that they had acceded to them. Serbia couldn't fight another war. They were completely broke. They had just been in 3 Balkan wars, and I'm including, of course, the wars against the Ottoman Turks throughout the latter part of the 19th century. In other words, they've been almost on a consistent state of war since the first uprising against the Janissaries. They simply couldn't maintain a war footing. So there was no one in Serbia, especially in the military, who wanted any war. They simply couldn't do it. But Britain was encouraging Austria to press its advantage in the Balkans, because any collapse of the Turkish Empire meant a victory for Russia. And make no mistake, the British would see tens of millions of Europeans killed in order to secure fairly minor advantages in an obscure part of the world. The most arrogant aspect of British foreign policy here, which is absolutely essential to the murder of Tsar Nicholas, is that after Russia had bled against Germany for what amounted to English interests, neither London or Paris would offer the Tsar safe passage. They rejected all appeals from the Russian government, and pro or anti-Russian, because even Kerensky was not interested in seeing the Tsar murdered. It was only the Germans that sought the Tsar's release. And the ambassador to St. Petersburg was offering large sums of money to ransom the monarch, and monarchist groups and the church itself was raising quite a bit of money to ransom him. But there's no amount of money that could satisfy this, because not only the symbolic and religious elements of the murder of the Tsar, but he was simply too dangerous. Now, I wrote a book called The Third Rome back when I was in my late 20s, and a lot of it, I wince when I read it. What it essentially came down to was it was an outline of what I was going to research for essentially the rest of my career. That's what that book was. It was an outline introducing the world to what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my academic life. And I've stayed to that, but there's a lot of errors in it. It was my first book after my dissertation, and there's certain things that I would retract today, and I've dealt with that in other places. But my position on Tsar Nicholas is, for the most part, has remained unchanged. And the murder of Tsar Nicholas was the end of the old order anywhere and everywhere. This was an obsession of the British, and the British government, or I should say the British banks in London, are the primary fomenters of war, and who wanted nothing more than the Tsar to be murdered and a relatively weak government to take over, that Russia would be divided up into easily manageable sections. However, there was also a faction that wanted a strong centralized Russia to keep Russia in the war against Germany. So it really depended on what faction in Great Britain saw which country as a greater threat. Those who had an interest in the Far East saw Russia as a threat, or in the Balkans. Those closer to home saw Germany as a greater threat. As most of you know, Germany was defeating England on the seas. Her submarine technology had outstripped that of the British, and the British had not developed counterweapons to the submarine, and Britain was essentially surrounded. Not being anywhere near self-sufficient in food, importing most of it, she was starving. Her losses were massive. Germany essentially fought the war by itself. And of course, it turns out that Germany was far stronger than even the British had realized. But the damage was done. Both Russia and Germany were crippled. And the tens of millions of bodies was, in the British mind, a small price to pay for the maintenance of the British Empire. But in their ignorance, what they didn't realize was that in overthrowing the old order, it would also mean the death of its own empire. But this is what happens when you think in relatively short periods of time rather than long term. However, the greatest evil in the British mind was Germany and Russia joining together. And they will do anything and say anything at the time to keep that from happening. And the same is going on today. But that's a separate issue. The nearly 40 Austrian divisions were used with a smattering of German troops to keep Russia occupied in the east, while Germany dealt with the French. Now, Austria was a great disappointment, and that was a problem for Germany. The German High Command performed very well against France and England, and the French had completely gone into a full-blown Napoleonic retreat. A full corps, so that several divisions, was sent to the eastern part of Germany to shore up the Austrian weakling that was now weakening and dealing with a Russian thrust into German-held territory, led by Tsar Nicholas himself. Then Nicholas, seeing the inability of Austria to continue the war and the clear defeat of France, decided to launch an assault against Germany and just distract her from the ultimate victory against Paris. Germany had interested herself in the potential wealth of Croatia and Slovenia. They had both been relatively faithful servants of Vienna. And they didn't seek to influence Vienna in any constructive way, but they understood the situation. Austria was in a full and humiliating retreat against an energetic Russia, and Germany was desperately needed to come to her rescue. The offensive in eastern Germany was called off against the original Russian move, and troops were sent southward to bail out what amounted to the flaccid Austrian state. Beginning in 1915, Austria was in collapse, so the planned German offensive against Paris was called off, as Russia had planned, and Russia was poised to win the war against the Central Powers by completely knocking Vienna out of the war and then marching on to Berlin, as the bulk of German forces were struggling in the trenches of the West. The Germans were also worried about a last-ditch British landing in the Balkans, which would have dealt a major blow to Germany if she had combined with Russia. Germany acted quickly, and hundreds of heavy guns were transferred from the Western Front and used to pound Russian positions, thriving on the corpse of Austria-Hungary. But Russia very quickly regrouped and hit Germany back hard, and von Hindenburg wrote in his memoirs, he said, "Our cavalry is driven back by this counterattacking foe," meaning the Russians. "The road to the east is again open to the Russians. We have arrived too late, and we are utterly exhausted." So it's a myth to say that Russia was on the losing end. But the fact of the matter is, no one could win World War I. The sheer number of bodies, the destruction of these governments, there were no winners other than the British bankers. And even there, their empire was soon going to crumble because the liberalism that they were espousing domestically was soon to take root in the Third World. But evaluated objectively, the military situation in Russia early 1917 was not dire. During 1916, the Russian army and the Austrian and Hungarian fronts went on the offensive and achieved major victories, although not in the German-held sections of the front. The shortage of ammunition was a long thing of the past. The army was supplied better than ever. The morale of the frontline troops was fully satisfactory. Like Bernard Parvus and Alfred Knox, who were there, said so. But the pessimism seemed to occur the farther you got away from the front. So what eventually happened was the Jewish and liberal press in Russia then took over. And that's where you get the mythology concerning Russian defeat. The press, not just in the East, but in the West as well, exaggerated the alleged Russian defeat against the Japanese and its shortage of ammunition and rifles and everything else. None of that was really true. But because the press was of one mind in reporting this, not having many people on the ground, it's taken as fact. But by late 1916, shortages, which everyone had suffered early on, was just a thing of the past. In fact, Russian mobilization was superior to the German in the early years of the war, according to Niall Ferguson. But the Russian army disintegrated once the Tsar was overthrown in February of 1917. The Bolsheviks had made a deal with the Germans, and they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that same year. And then the regular forces of the Tsar became the so-called White Armies and fought the much better funded Bolshevik forces. The Duma, which had been forced upon Russia by the revolution of 1905, did very little. The factions in the Duma could agree on no common action, and so they called a provisional committee, which essentially was a mouthpiece of the Masonic Kerensky government. The Bolsheviks were well-funded, well-armed, well under centralized command, ultimately triumphed. Leon Trotsky was the commander of the Red Army, not because he had any military experience, he did not, but he was a financier of the army, and he was so ruthless and soulless that he was willing to sacrifice untold numbers of non-Jewish males for the sake of his agenda. The liberals in the army were led by General Alexeyev, who had asked the Tsar to abdicate. They tried to use the Bolsheviks tried to use the most vile, hypocritical, patriotic propaganda against the monarchy, claiming that Alexander was German, and therefore they really were deliberately throwing the war in German favor. Of course, they knew that this wasn't true, but that was the attempt. So really, the British ruling classes, which were sleazy as you can get, they were petitioned to take Nicholas as refugees, and due to even after the massive blood that Russia had shed for English causes, he was not released. The pictures that they had scrolled in the room. Now remember, there is no Apatiev house. That was owned by the family called Yeltsin. It was a Jewish gold merchant family of ill repute, or so it was said. There were three, the Hebrew letter Lamed. Now Lamed refers to the heart, and the heart is the king of the body. The remainder of the occult physiology is the Nesham, the brain, Ruach, the heart, and Nefesh, the liver, or the subconscious. The realm of Nefesh is a realm of sort of occult ideology or psychoanalysis. The destruction of the heart is a symbolic destruction of the king or the heart of the nation, its guiding light. The double Lamed is often used in Arabic society to refer to a man being torn to pieces. It also refers to the 12th card of the tarot deck, which is a man hanging by 1 foot from a pole, which is horizontally, which is significant to the occult. One set between two trees on which 6 branches have been cut. The man's arms are tied and folded in such a way to create this triangle pointing down, while the man's head forming the point or apex of the triangle. So this symbol was used and drawn on the wall of the Apatiev house, A horizontal line is drawn underneath the letters, which represents passivity. In other words, as the slogan said, they were acting on orders from a higher power. But the hanged man in the tarot deck represents a major turning point in human history where all beliefs have been turned upside down. The rule of deception. It's a direct rule of aliens. The murder of the king brings a period in their mind of peace and self-actualization, according to occult adepts, and a concept that's well thought out in Freud in his Civilization as Discontent. It also, as you may have noticed, approximates the Star of David, where God is captured and reversed. The hanged man is a reversal of values and the destruction of a state of war. That is to say, the conquest of the realm of God, and this is from the Jewish point of view. God has to die, so the story goes, so that the aliens or the outsiders might live. So the Talmud is absolutely essential because their Judaism collectively becomes God and therefore Antichrist. So we translated what these symbols were. And the sacrifice of the king that brings about the destruction of the kingdom. It is, first of all, the notion that orthodoxy, which the Tsar is the head, the earthly head, so to speak, has been overthrown. It means, secondly, that the monarchy is a form of society, not merely a form of state. It's about political power. And there's another translation from the website of the Apotheof House that says another version of what I said before. Here, through secret forces, the Tsar has been offered in sacrifice so that his country may be destroyed. All peoples, that is Goyim, are informed of the event. So Lamed is a powerful word, letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It initially meant an ox goad, a way to get oxen moving. But it also means to teach and to learn. It's often used as a dialectical negation. And all of these make perfect sense in the destruction of the royal family. But there's even more that suggests, clearly the occult influences are everywhere here. And one of the better book, I want to say better book, because the English language histories of this are all equally bad. But some are worse than others. Edward Radzinski, The Last Tsar, strongly suggests, but doesn't come out and say, the arcane methodology used here. But he refers to the murders of sacrifices twice in his book. I don't know if he did that on purpose or not. And he mentions on page 247, he says something bizarre, almost out of nowhere. In referring to the Tsar, he says, he was a special Taurus, a golden calf, a calf born for sacrifice. Now, the mention of the sacred bull, the calf of Hebrew paganism in the Old Testament, is way too coincidental to be just a mere literary flourish. And he says this on page 324 of his very famous book. He says this. There are more hints, however. The name of the operation to murder the Tsar was called chimney sweep. It's telling because a chimney sweep was also the main form of child slavery found in early industrial England. And this is, again, that was what he said. Now I'm speaking here now. And it was actually Michael Hoffman who first taught me about the chimney sweep, abuse of children, and slavery in industrial England. So it refers to the sacrifice of children on the altar of industrialization, wherein the occult, the arcane lord, the realm of Saturn, the god who sacrifices children in the process of severing man's connection with nature. Industrialization is the exoteric realm of Saturn, where machines control nature, they separate man from it, and they create a virtual world over and above the natural one. Of course, we're in the very advanced stages of that. It's kind of strange that Yurovsky, who was the main man, brings back the many pieces of stolen silver to the Tsar just before their execution. Now, that's a ritual act. Now, as the letter Lamed suggests, the murder of the Tsar is classic killing of the king ritual, so important to Masonry and modern magic. I've spoken about it on this lecture series many, many times. Why return these pieces of silver to the Tsar just before his execution? It really is the process of creating some royal pomp to provide the murder with greater psychological weight. It also comes up again on the borders of Ekaterinburg, Now, this is also the city of the Empress Catherine, the woman who was involved in the murder of Tsar Peter III. A murder just on the eve of liberation, so to speak. One might answer that the whites were trying to rescue the Tsar, and thus it necessitated the murder, which doesn't make any sense because the English language books say the Tsar was unpopular. So what difference did it make? How could he be used to rally around? Why would liberating the Tsar be a threat at all, then? If the whites were fighting for the Duma, how the liberation of the Tsar is anyway relevant to anything here? The liberation ploy was a show, something to elevate the tension, making the ritual, which ultimately has psychological roots, more powerful, magically speaking. As it turns out, the Cheka were involved in faking a series of letters from army officers loyal to the Tsar and sending them to Nicholas. Much later, members of the execution squad admitted that this royalist plot, in which the executioners were obsessed, was something manufactured by the Cheka. It gets even crazier because the Impactiev house has one of its basement windows. The window behind where the family was murdered was situated precisely between two trees. A fact pointedly brought out by Radzinski and precisely necessary to carry out the ritual, at least as the 12th card of the tarot deck mentions. As I've said before, at the time of the overthrow of the Tsar, the world's greatest epidemic was unleashed. About 700,000 Americans were killed. Between 1917 and 1921, about 4% of the world's population was wiped out. Now, for those who aren't really familiar with the financiers behind the revolution, people don't understand why wealthy capitalists, or really oligarchs, would ever want to support the Red Forces, which at least in public wanted to nationalize these banks. Well, Eustace Mullins says this in reply. These Americans of the finest temper chose Lenin to do their dirty work because he had outlined the plan that they wanted in the threatening catastrophe in September 1917. And the first part of that was the nationalization of the banks. Ownership of capital, which is manipulated by the banks, is not lost or changed when the banks are nationalized and fused into one state bank, so that it's possible to reach a stage where the state knows whither and how and from where and at what time millions and billions are flowing. Only control for bank operations, providing their immersion to one state bank, will allow, simultaneously, with other measures, which can be easily put into effect, the actual levying of the income tax without concealment of property and income. Mullins says that on page 66. In other words, the communist program had always been in the interest of the bankers to completely standardize the Russian system, which, of course, up until then did not have a central bank. It was important if the massive wealth of the country was to be controlled. The massive economic success of Tsar Alexander III and Nicholas II was really titillating the globe's oligarchy. So, from the book Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, which is Anthony Sutton's work, he says this. Although Jacob Schiff's personal agent, George Kennan, had regularly toured Russia during the latter part of the 19th century, bringing in money and arms for the communist revolutionaries, his grandson said that Schiff had spent $20 million to bring about the Bolshevik Revolution. More concerted aid was called for to support the entire regime. Kennan also aided Schiff in financing the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and in fact the Japanese decorated Kennan with the Gold War Medal in the Order of the Sacred Treasure. In 1915, the American International Corporation was formed in New York. Its principal goal was the coordination of aid, particularly financial assistance to the Bolsheviks, which had previously been provided by Schiff and other bankers on an informal basis. The new firm was funded by J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, and the National City Bank. And he says that on pages 64 and 65. And then the great historian Nesta Webster, she writes in The Surrender of an Empire, had the Bolsheviks been, as they're represented, a mere gang of revolutionaries out to destroy property, first in Russia and then in every other country, they would naturally have found themselves up against organized resistance by owners of property all over the world. and the Moscow blaze would have rapidly been extinguished. It was only owing to the powerful influences behind them that this minority party was able to seize the reins of power, and having seized them, retain their hold of them to the present day. But Sutton, almost following to an extent on Webster, he says, in brief, this is a story of the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath, but a story that departs from the usual conceptual straitjacket approach of capitalist versus communist. Our story postulates a partnership between international monopoly capital and international revolutionary socialism for their mutual benefit. The final human cost of this alliance has fallen upon the shoulders of the individual Russian and the individual American. Entrepreneurship has been brought into disrepute, and the world has been propelled toward inefficient socialist planning as a result of these monopoly maneuverings in the world of politics and revolution. So the revolution of 1905 was a prelude to the later revolution and funded by the same people for the same goal. The complete standardization of the Russian state and therefore the complete transparency of Russian financial transactions. Standardization means control. The ultimate capitalist, as well as the ultimate communist gnosis, is a complete concentration of all productive forces under the control of a single unified body. So Lenin, the Schiffs, the Rockefellers, and Warburgs, to this respect, in this extent, had identical interests. Now, I've spoken on this show about the so-called pogroms. They didn't happen. Now, I have articles on this. I have lectures on this. I don't have tons of time to go into them. But this was the justification for the overthrow of the Tsar in the Western premise. Really the simple best argument for, attacking the notion of the pogroms being somehow organized by St. Petersburg is that they all occurred in the far west of the empire and some of the most economically advanced parts of it. The state had absolutely no interest in seeing these extremely strategic cities up in flames. Any analysis of these so-called pogroms show more Christians than Jews having been killed. There were no laws on gun ownership in Tsarist Russia whatsoever, and certainly none that could be enforced. So the Jewish militia in these cities like Odessa, they owned heavy weapons, they owned artillery pieces, they owned 50 caliber machine guns, and were very well armed and had been training in that area. And this is essentially what this is the pogrom czar was almost the name that he was given. And the sources for these so-called atrocities were from the New York Times and the London Times, as well as the Jewish World. The Jewish World newspaper furnished the majority of these tall tales, having sent a reporter to visit areas that had suffered. And although most of the other papers simply repeated what the Jewish World had sent them. And that provoked global outrage. And it was in the United States that this public indignation had reached this height. And the historian Edward Judge, he states in his work in 2012 that the American public was spurred on by reports of the brutal beatings, multiple rapes, dismemberment of corpses, senseless slaughter, painful suffering, and unbearable grief, which was his quote. And really one of the worst parts of all of this was the Russian popular press from 1905. It was overwhelmingly Jewish owned. Jews had more than freedom of movement throughout the empire, and of course were the wealthiest single element, at least in the western part of the empire. There was full freedom of the press in Russia, most unfortunately, because all these people did is they invented the wildest stories. And the notion of satire and a news article were very much blurred. There was no press censorship even during World War I. And like all the world's newspapers, it was largely Jewish and liberal. And the liberal press, not owned by Jews, really pretty much repeated what the more powerful press agencies throughout the world were saying. And unfortunately, the Jewish World, as well as newspapers in Russia, were taken as true by the Western press with really no criticism. You got to remember, 1910, 1915, 1920, the 10-year period and beyond, the Western world knew almost nothing about Russian history and Russian politics. You had your classic propaganda lines, the murders of women and infants, rape of underage girls. One Jew had his belly ripped open and his insides came out. A Jewish woman had nails driven into her head through her nostrils, on and on and on. This kind of lurid reporting was not even meant to be literally true, but it's what the Jews felt to be experiencing. And of course, far more Christians were killed than Jews. And this is really the most horrible form of muckraking. Solzhenitsyn says this. Moreover, because of their cohesion and solidarity, they, that is the Jews, have, with few exceptions, directed all their efforts not towards the increase of the productive strength of the state, but primarily towards the exploitation of the poorest classes of the surrounding population. So anyway, like for example, 1905, the Kiev program saw the death toll of a few hundred. 12% were Jews. Generally, the so-called pogroms were started by a very well-armed Jewish revolutionary group attacking the Russian nationalists in any given area. In Odessa, a Black Hundred march was interrupted by a bomb thrown by Jacob Brightman. In 1906, in Chernigov, incitement leaflets were traced to Israel Tomgolsky, Yankel Bruk, and Pinkus Krygsky, and they called for the murder of all royalists, death to the Tsar, and shutting down all royalist newspapers. And even the Duma, the Russian parliament, in February of 1917, called for the death of all royalists. These so-called pogroms were instigated by Jewish militias and did far more damage to the Christian population. But at any time a Jew had been killed in retaliation or during the fighting, it was reported as a pogrom. William Randolph Hearst said, "We accuse the Russian government of bearing the responsibility for the Chisinau slaughter. We declare that the Holocaust is steeped in blood. It is on Nicholas's door that lie these killings and violence. May the God of justice come into this." And these citations are from the works from Platonov. And he concludes by saying, sweeping this hotbed of hate from the earth as a plague. Ironically, the plague that was very soon to envelop the world. So William Randolph Hearst called for the absolute slaughter of Russian royalists and the Russian state. Now, what really frightened the left, globally speaking, I'm referring to whether it be liberals or communists or anyone that we generally refer to as being on the left of the spectrum. So the Russian Empire was growing in terms of demographics by about 2.4 million people a year. And this really is the cause of British worry, because demographics are power. The Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas and his father, Alexander III, had almost no debt, at least no long-term debt, and the budget was in surplus every year. And the reason for this is that about 60% of the budget was under the direct supervision of the Tsar, not the parliament. And as has been said many other places, the tax burden of the Russian subject was 9 times lighter than that of liberal England and 4 times lighter than that of France. Of course, the average worker in Russia had absolutely nothing to complain about. So they needed to create issues that didn't exist. Now, I also need to mention Rasputin. I've mentioned on this show the Kerensky emergency inquest that he, right after the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas, had engaged in hoping to justify the revolution and find all kinds of corruption. And this is what the EIC stated in 19 July of 1917. And this is, by the way, from his enemies. This is V.I. Rudnev, the chief researcher for the Emergency Committee. This testimonial delivered to Mikhail Lebelkov certifies that not a single indication of Gregory Rasputin's political activity was disclosed by the High Commission of Inquiry. The inquiry into the influence of Rasputin on the imperial family was intensive, but it was definitively established that the influence had its source only in the profound religious sentiment of their majesties. The only favor Rasputin accepted was a rental of his lodging, paid by the personal chancellery of his majesty. It also accepted presents made at the hands of the imperial family, like shirts and things like that. Rasputin had no connection with any foreign authorities. But all pamphlets and newspaper articles on the subject of Rasputin, his influence, and other rumors and gossip were fabricated by the powerful enemies of the emperor. This statement is given under the signature and seal of the Attorney General of the High Commission. Now, this provisional government, after the formal abdication of the Tsar in 1917, or what we think was that, had full access to all the private papers of Tsar Nicholas, the Duma, all government ministries. Never has there been an exhaustive commission into the form, behavior, structure, functioning of the royal government has ever even been attempted. Given the full access to all the records of the commission, most of which, by the way, was destroyed by the Bolsheviks for obvious reasons, they found not only no moral problems with Rasputin, but also that the imperial government maintained the highest standards of personal dignity while holding office. And all of this from the sworn enemies of the imperial state. Another quote from this is, "It turns out that the supreme power in the last months of the old regime itself gradually delegated parts of their sovereign rights in the hands of ministers or senior officials. All of us, dear comrades, lived under the old regime, and we all know what was being done. We all think something terrible is happening in the police department. You know, in all fairness, it should be, not as it is in the depraved imagination of the Russian people, but what is really there. In front of me is a document which is a Magna Carta of the police department as to its lawlessness. The document is called the Instruction on the Organization and Conduct of the Gendarme and Investigative Offices. Entire generations who gave themselves to the police had a hand in the creation of this manual, and all of them gradually perfected the system." In other words, this man could find absolutely nothing in the police department worthy of any kind of legal prosecution. It does say something about the provisional government, that they were interested in the truth rather than violence for its own sake. And it also means that Kerensky didn't trust the ramblings of the media, as slanderous as it was. But this commission is kept out of the history textbooks for a reason. And because these men went through every paper relevant to this, spoke of Rasputin as having very little influence, of not ever even visiting the palace. He just wanted to go home. Rasputin was something that was invented by the press because they couldn't attack the Tsar directly. Rasputin never took any credit for his services. He never sought any kind of favors as a result of it. He was vehemently opposed to any kind of mesmerism or hypnosis. He was not even aware of these techniques. Rasputin would routinely just leave the company of the royal family, just to leave to go back to Siberia. This is where his family was. They begged him to return. Obviously, he wasn't power mad. He was just trying to get home. But eyewitnesses say that there's no evidence that Rasputin had any political agenda whatsoever. He respected the reigning royal family, but there's no evidence he was even royalist. Rasputin didn't have much of a political agenda. He was far from a perennial presence there. And it didn't take him long to make enemies for no other reason than the press was saying that he is this leader. You see this even today, where Alexander Dugin is said to be the confidant of Vladimir Putin. Dugin has never had any role as an advisor to him. Absolutely none. He has no formal government position, and chances are that Dugin probably writes over the head of anyone in government. He has no influence over the state. Now, he has influence over the society as a whole, and therefore from that indirect source may have it. But without anyone knowing anything about the society, they could pretty much say anything. So, part of the problem, part of the reason that people hated Rasputin was that he was keeping the Tsarevich alive. That he was clearly, he knew quite a bit about medications. He was a man who was bringing some of the traditional medicine of Siberia to the Tsarevich himself. I mean, this is actually a very practical matter. He had no political power. He had no political agenda. He didn't even want to be there. And this is just how it goes. Contrary to everything that you've heard, he had no desire for power. He was not a drinker. He didn't have an out-of-control libido. But needing a character to be invented to attack the Tsar is what created this mythology about Rasputin. The High Commission of Inquiry had completely debunked the police reports that made Rasputin out to be this drunk rapist. It didn't exist. These are largely rumor. And the High Commission of Kerensky said that there's simply no truth to them. And of course there was a cabal who didn't like the idea that Rasputin was keeping the Tsarevich alive. And, by the way, very much opposed to Russian entry into World War I, but the only political position he had that anyone knows about. And then Prince Yusupov, and actually Felix Yusupov was, tried to bribe Rasputin to get him to say things, and he was refused. In fact, Yusupov had been Yusupov, I should say, had to leave for England because he was simply embarrassed. And Yusupov began to circulate stories about Rasputin in the English press in his exile in London. That's where, starting about 1909 forward, Prince Yusupov was giving interviews with the British press where he was saying, I'm an eyewitness to this kind of horrible stuff that he was doing. And none of it was true. None of it is true. Remember, most of the nobility, the upper nobility in St. Petersburg, had long since been converted to liberalism. Many of them resented the tradition and the traditionalism of the emperor. And certainly the presence of an uneducated hick at court. Now, Rasputin was not uneducated. He had strong peasant roots. But he only showed up when the Tsarevich needed him, and at no other time. The nobility had long since, threw their weight behind liberal reform, and slowly through the Masonic lodges, which even the mainstream press in America says were very, very powerful in Russia, mobilized this nobility to the point where the emperor was surrounded by turncoats and traitors. Each one of these families viewing themselves as the future president of a Republican Russia, or even as the next emperor. He could trust absolutely nobody. There was a report that Rasputin was a member of the Khilisti sect, and there's absolutely no evidence to that either. Yusupov in London concocted many stories, and to have a dark figure like Rasputin looming over the palace, making decisions, that was something that the Western press just ate up. They loved it. Tsar Nicholas was too popular in Russia itself to really attack him in the press. It was not a good idea, politically speaking. And yet, creating Rasputin was a way to indirectly attack the monarchy. Police officer N. Prelina stated his report January 4th, 1910, that Rasputin was never drunk. He wasn't a drinker at all. There was a theory that some policemen had developed that Rasputin was brought in to heal the schism of the old belief. And you have many who were saying that, and saying even today, and it's a very popular theory in Russia now, is that the murder of Rasputin was the first stage in the revolutionary coup. His murder was the first shot in the revolution. Rasputin was a means to desacralize the monarchy without actually attacking it directly. The Archbishop Ambrose Shurov, in a royalist conference in 2002, said that Rasputin suffered many attacks from the enemies of Russia. The press created hatred of the crown so as to cast a shadow on the royal family. In other words, they were using this man. You had many saintly elders like Jerome or Kirill Pavlov, Nicholas Sugoranov, who were there at the time and who, really venerated Rasputin for his righteous behavior. Now, I think the very first attack of any depth on Rasputin came in 1910, and it came from the Supreme Council of Russian Freemasonry and its two organs, which were Slovo and the Russian Word. And so the Masons, Malakov, Gessin, Benever, and the twin brothers, Princes Dologorky, were the owners and backers of this journal. And B.I. Nicholas's book on Russian Freemasonry strongly implicates the Supreme Council as a major player in the fight against the crown, using Rasputin as a foil. But it was M.V. Rodzianko, who was the chair of the Duma, who fully admitted that it was the Masonic Congress in Brussels that created the first attacks on Rasputin. You had a Russian Baptist, J.S. Prokhanov, stating that with Rasputin gone, the Reformation can be brought to Russia, meaning the Protestant Reformation. It's not too far of a stretch here to consider the causes of the fall of the Tsardom, and by that the end of the era of the Christian state inaugurated by St. Constantine the Great in the 4th century, of which the Russian Tsar was a direct descendant. And you can summarize this, the rise of Rasputin in World War I, the Orthodox remnant become very, very small. The defensive in this church was very scattered. The leadership of the church was Republican. Only a handful of bishops could be called committed monarchists. So what do we have? And anyone who wants to study the murder of Tsar Nicholas and the family, and this gradual desacralization of the royal house in general, has to deal with the consequences of what occurred here. The rise, the provisional government was, they had a very limited role in Russian history. They weren't around for very long. They had no real ideology other than Freemasonry itself. And, the Bolsheviks being far better funded. Because the Allies had given up on the Kerensky government, the White Armies didn't get a penny from them. And I've spoken about this at length elsewhere, because the Whites were not royalists. In fact, most of them were anti-royalist, and also not aristocratic either. The White High Command was overwhelmingly from the people, contrary to Red propaganda. That's not the case in the Red Army, by the way. But what happened in Russia after the murder of the Tsar pretty much is all you need to know to justify the existence of the monarchy. Whether it be the Republican system from 1990 to roughly 2004, the Bolshevik Revolution itself, Stalin's purges, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany, whichever tack that you take, we'll see the utter destruction and evil that came from this. Antichrist was able to rule openly. The Soviets were one manifestation of Antichrist. And as time has gone on, the very crude violence of the Soviet Union gave way to a far more subtle manipulation of images that postmodernity has developed into in the West, where the definitions of words, the way that people think, the use of psychology to probe every weakness of humanity, mentally speaking, is being used to completely shift not just what people think about, but how they think in the first place. The redefinition of words, the rewriting of history. We're at a stage now in America, 2018, where right-wing opinion is de facto illegal. Now, you have the First Amendment, but of course that's just a formality. The government is not the issue here. private capital is. Private capital is protected by the First Amendment. It's not subject to it, even though private capital has far more powerful than the state does. To be a nationalist in America is to be fired from every job you can have, and we all know people in this boat, to be forbidden an education, even forbidden to have a family, have any kind of a normal social life in any way, shape, matter, or form. In other words, it's illegal in all but the formal. There is no law banning this, although with hate speech, of course. As Edgar Steele once said, once they redefine speech as a form of violence, it will then be de jure illegal, not just de facto. And if something happens to us, such that we're thrown in prison, or as poor Edgar Steele himself, murdered, who's going to come to our defense? No one in the press cares. And it's really not that hard to draw a line from the murder of Tsar Nicholas to this present situation. The Third Reich was a last-ditch attempt to crush the Soviet Union and bring about nationalism as the counter-revolutionary ideology. And that failed, as we all know. Just like Tsar Nicholas, Hitler was surrounded by traitors and agents, the least of which was Erich Koch in Ukraine. Russia was the key to victory for Germany. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia saw Hitler as the foundation of social justice in the industrial age. And Metropolitan Anastasi had called for a Russian Hitler to take over in Russia after Stalin. One of the most significant elements to all of this is the fact that the arcana, the occult, is very explicitly stated in the propaganda and the graffiti on the wall of that house to be absolutely essential. This is primarily a spiritual development. The monarchy in Russia was a religious figure. There was no secular state. I mean, there was de facto, but that's not the understanding of symphony. I have a separate lecture on that. I've been through very briefly all the symbols found scrolled on the wall. And that concept, by the way, of killing the king for the sake of destroying society, that's a formula. That's been found in several other places. In 1942 in Palestine, a group of Zionists had assassinated a British agent there. And that was, just without any reference to the king, scrolled on the wall there as well. The reference to hidden forces, the destruction of society, essentially bringing about revolution. And when they used the phrase Balthasar, they spelled the last four letters with T-S-A-R, which was a deliberate play on words. And the Hanging Man tarot card is about the transvaluation of all values. This is why the killing of the king is the essential ritual in modernity and post-modernity. And the reason it's been successful is that the Jews are the center. And the Jews are so ethnically cohesive that their lack of numbers don't matter. What they are really examples of nationalism, although in this case for a perverted reason. The symbols are absolutely saturated in the murder of the Tsar. This was explicitly a demonic ritual. It was primarily a religious act. Therefore, we're talking about the absolute proof of the nature of the occult arcana and how it views monarchy, which is why monarchy is the really only legitimate form of government from the Orthodox point of view, coming from Samuel and David in the Old Testament. The era of the judges was very brief. And the only problem that the prophet Samuel had with the Israelites demanding a monarch was really that they wanted to be a monarch like everyone else. So it was the everyone else part, not the monarchy part, that was condemned. Monarchy is the only form of legitimate Orthodox government. And I don't necessarily even mean that you have to have a long-standing royal house. Because in Serbia, the royal house, whether it be Abrenović or Karađorđević, is only early 19th century and doesn't go beyond that. Someone like Putin or General Franco or someone like that is also acceptable from the royalist point of view. It doesn't have to be a literal hereditary sacred house. That might be nice, but it's not absolutely necessary. Even in Byzantium, or the old Roman Empire before that, you really didn't have any law concerning succession. But how the Jewish elite viewed monarchy as the entity most inimical to their interests, and how liberal republicanism is essentially their ideology. You know, as we said, the letter Lamed in the Hebrew alphabet actually referred to an ox goad. This is how to force the oxen, which is essentially another word for goyim, into action. It's the simple fact that the goyim are so ignorant that only, this ritual can spur them into action, that there's nothing worth fighting for. The abulia, or the lethargy that most people have today, but a lethargy that's born of the fact that there is no truth, and therefore there's nothing to be excited about. And the symbols all form a really cohesive whole. And even when you have mainline writers like Radzinski talking of Tsar Nicholas as a golden calf, a calf born for sacrifice, this is really, there's simply no denying that these forces exist, and the explicit mention of the sacrifice of the monarch to demons in exchange for power. They're not fooling around here. This is exactly what they said. This is exactly what they meant. And when you have mainline sources having to admit that, you're at a different stage in history. So the Kali Yuga era, the era of iron in the Roman understanding, began with the murder of Tsar Nicholas. Rome had finally fallen, albeit temporarily. Finally, it shows that Russia is the center of all things, that no other nation has this level of significance, that the last Christian empire was that of Russia up until 1917. And what happens to Russia happens to the world. And Russian ethnicity is a religious matter, not necessarily an ethnic matter. And so, I'm far more Russian than Lenin could ever be. Keep in mind, too, that, Jews today, make up a minuscule percentage of the Russian population. Many of them have left the country, starting in the 1970s. But this is the core of what we're talking about here. There's an explicit mention of demons and the humiliation, the verbal and physical assault on the girls. And this is all ritualistic and explicitly stated as such in the formula. So here we are, 100 years almost exactly from the start of the end, so to speak. These are the end times. If it isn't, then everything in scriptures is false. There could be no question about it. This is the new era. This is the era of iron, and very explicitly, given the symbols that were used at the Ipatiev house. And even that was a matter of deception, because there's no Ipatiev who owned that place. Because of this, we have started the era of iron. And the Orthodox Church has now been reduced to a handful. And one thing that you want to take away from all of this is how few of the Russian bishops at the time were willing to support Nicholas. This is one of the reasons that the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia had stated that, Russia itself is responsible for the murder of Tsar Nicholas. Because the Church overwhelmingly had backed the provisional government. Remember, it was a provisional government that called the Synod of 1918. that elected Tikhon. The monarch didn't do that. And he would be the only authority that had that capacity. The overwhelming majority of the high clergy was opposed to Tsar Nicholas and was quite happy to see him go. And a handful, like St. Macarius, for example, of Moscow, Metropolitan, were purged from the church. And so you see the rot that had entered into this society through the Masonic city of St. Petersburg. So this is what you take away from all of this: the destruction, the irrationality. That everything that we despise today comes from this 100-year-old event. The murder of the Tsar, the killing of the king, was a sacrifice which made all the evil that have come afterwards possible. Anyway, I've gone over my time. The miracles that have been attributed to Tsar Nicholas is overwhelming. There can be no doubt that he's interceding on a regular basis for his people here, for his Orthodox people here. And there is only one political system, and that is monarchy of one form or another. And the murder of Tsar Nicholas shows just how essential monarchy is in restraining Antichrist in these last times. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is a special edition because today is the 17th of July, 2018, making this the date of the 100th anniversary of the murder of Tsar Nicholas and his family. Last week, I gave part one of my analysis and understanding of the situation, something I've spent more or less the last 28 years worrying about. And we're going to conclude that today and understand just how powerful and significant this anniversary is. A century ago, the last Roman emperor was murdered with his family. And I spoke last time about the minyan. There was at least 10 here. I talked about the group who did this. Goloshekin, F.I. Goloshekin, who was one of the heads of the Euro Party unit. The ringleader and the most vile, Jacob Yurovsky, son of a rabbi. Felix Dzerzhinsky, who wasn't there, but he was one of those who ordered this. His real last name was Rubin. They claimed to be Polish, and they had all kinds of fake nobility papers and all that. Jacob Sverdlov, of course, was essential. His name is Yankel Solomon. Lesser-known figures, V.N. Netrevin, S.P. Vaganov, A.G. Gabanov, George Safarov. His real name was Volodin. P.K. Voykov, whose real name was Pinkas Weiner. Gregory Nikulin, Konstantin Myachin, whose real last name was Akovlev. Peter Markov, whose ethnicity is in question. Konstantin Myachin, who I mentioned already. Yakovlev doesn't sound really like a Jewish name to American ears, but of course the son of Jacob. Which should be stressed here. Which, Jacob is not necessarily, it's a Hebrew term, but it's not necessarily a Jewish name. Michael is a Hebrew word, or Raphael is a Hebrew word. Jonathan's Hebrew. P.S. Medvedev and M.A. Kudrin, who I mentioned last time, they were both named Medvedev. And then you had others, those a bit higher than them, not as high, of course, as Dzerzhinsky and Sverdlov, who were dominant figures, but local figures. S.C. Tutskov, who was another local boss, the Euro Party district, and Belobodorov, whose real name was Yankel Izidorovich. So you had two people involved in this with the first name of Yankel. You can't get any more Jewish than this. It's like the Oscars. And we talked about last time the pornographic images, what was scrawled on the wall, the message, the warning, how, the regime has gone absolutely crazy trying to repress this. The Jewish apoplexy when Tsar Nicholas and his family were canonized. And of course, the central figure of Rasputin. I mentioned last time that both France and Britain had the chance of rescuing Tsar Nicholas, and both made it a point to say no. And I said only Germany sought his release. Now, I want to give broader context here. I've been a professional academic researcher in philosophy, politics, and history for 3 separate fields for 28 years. I've done nothing else but this for almost 30 years. It's staggering, the sheer amount of material I've been through, good, bad, and indifferent. I have 8 books out. I've taught all over the country. I've been through hell, marriage, divorce, everything else. But let me tell you, and this is very relevant to what we're going to talk about here, I have a list of things, general truths that I've learned, things that I've learned that I didn't want to learn. Things that I wish weren't true. These are things that only experience can teach you. And let me summarize them briefly. Number 1, almost all historical knowledge that the average educated American has is sheer fantasy. And they have no way of correcting that, really. Number 2, truth is almost never a concern for people when it comes to making general decisions, especially about who they are, their identity, their mission, what they're going to support and not. Number 3, freedom is a meaningless abstraction. The term freedom abstractly is something that people love, but the minute you say that you are then responsible for what you do with that freedom, they hate it. They want to be empowered, but they forget that power is in fact an awful burden. Number 4, humans are not rational, and therefore they're not free. Rationality is hard. Rationality is difficult. Freedom is almost impossible for most people, because that means you have to use critical reason all the time. Number 5 is that to be human, you have to be both rational and free. That's the nature of humanity. Otherwise, you're just this hunk of flesh on 2 legs. So number 6, free will is a result of ascetic struggle and study. No one's born this way. Free will, if it's really free and it's really willful, is usually nothing but pain. Number 7, the individual is a myth. The individual doesn't even make sense. Nothing that the individual does actually belongs to him. The technology that I'm using, the language that I'm using, the logic that I'm using, the historical knowledge, none of this is mine. Nothing. Individualism is a contradiction because the minute you try to defend it, you're using communal property, logic, knowledge, emotion, the language and gestures and the whole community of meaning that you have to have for any words that we use to make sense. The individual is ridiculous and did not exist really until industrialization. Number 8 is one of the hardest ones. And that is that people want to hear only what serves their interest. Number 9, very few people are capable of love. And that includes children. Loving their children. Love is very difficult. Love is as difficult as analysis. Self-interest is the dominant emotion, and that's the very opposite of love. At the same time, number 10, very few people are capable of sustained thought. So what I mean to say is that reason and things that go into reason, like evidence, they're almost never the cause of anyone adopting some opinion. Number 12, people can rationalize anything. It's one of the most horrible things to learn. Women are better at this than men are, but everyone does it. That means you can never trust anyone. And you live in a society where there is no truth, and therefore you could rationalize anything. Number 13, today in universities, serious historical criticism is almost non-existent. Number 14 sounds odd, but there are people out there who have never suffered. You think everyone has problems, everyone suffers. I'm telling you that there are a few people out there who have never suffered a day in their lives. Number 15, insanity. That is to say, to be a psychopath is far more common than people realize. Number 16, people lie constantly. And it gets to the point where often they don't know the difference one way or the other. And finally, most arguments come down to disagreements over the meaning of terms. So even if you assume that someone knows how to think rationally, which is only a handful of people, and it's very hard to do, the terms that we use, today's English bears very little resemblance to the English even just a century ago. Words have radically changed their meanings, both in terms of what they connote and what they denote. That group of 17 things is the result of a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. I didn't know any of this when I first went to college. But there is no escaping it. People know that this is true, but they hate to say it, and they don't want to believe it. Because if this is true, then ideologies like liberal democracy, human rights, the free market, they'll have to go out the window. Because none of them make any sense if those 17 things, or even half of them, are true. We assume, these ideologies assume that the average person, say the average educated person, be nice about it, can identify their self-interest. That I know doesn't exist. And I'll tell you why here in a minute. That they can tell the difference between the common good and their own good. That they can act in the most efficient way possible. That their major decisions are based on facts and sound reasoning, not emotion or some other heteronymous drama. We assume, and this is not a rational assumption, that people seek to avoid harm and pursue the good. And finally, that a moral community exists within which people can think and act. But that's just a smattering of things that one has to assume if you want to make, the free market or human rights or liberal democracy make any sense. I wrote the book, The Third Rome. I was 29, I think. I had a young family. And the book was angry. So those of you who've read it, there's a lot of it that I would retract today. Not the general thrust, of course, but I was angry. And I was angry because I was just learning these things. For decades, I've slaved over difficult texts and translation. I've built arguments in the most painstaking fashion, only to leave the academy and to learn that evidence and logic are of no interest to people. Or it only works if they're rationalizing something. The anger that I felt, the anger that I continue to feel in my writing, and it's certainly there, comes from this fact. Now, the Third Rome, there's much there that I would change. I would stress, for example, that the 18th century saw a total disruption in the crown succession. Only really one Orthodox person the entire century was on the throne, and that's Elizabeth. You could include Peter II maybe, but he was only there for a short time. I would talk more about the Mongol horde not being Asian. I would have defended Rasputin. I would have dealt with Ivan Mazep and the Cossacks far more, Lithuania and Ukraine. There's a lot of things there in general that I would change. But the Third Rome really, as I said before, it turned out to be an outline of what the rest of my life was going to be. And to that extent, I'm very proud of it. The general argument, of course, is simple. The general argument of that book, and it became the dominant argument of my career, is that there's really only one choice in politics: monarchy or oligarchy. The common good or self-interest. And self-interest always devolves to mean the interest of the powerful. See, if you preach self-interest, and that you should be free, free in quotes, to pursue your own interests, the assumption there's a lot of assumptions behind that. And this is why I say that, rationality is so hard and is so rare. Because part of what it does is take something like, a simple, a concept like that, and sees how many assumptions it's based upon that no one would ever accept. I hated the notion that, well, let me put it like this. I lost my train of thought there, but let me put it like this. People in the public arena, anything from like a discussion at a bar to, congressional debates, they rely on arguments. The entire judicial system relies on arguments. But I'm telling you that one of the most difficult things to do intellectually is to build an argument. Debating for me, which I only do verbally, is really getting boring. Because even basic logical designs are beyond even academics. You know what graduate school is, in both the humanities and the social sciences, is how to construct an argument. That's all it is. They assume that you're learning about the content of your field. They just take that for granted. What they talk about is the form. And as I've gotten older, I've realized just how significant that is. Building an argument is really hard. Building an argument takes a lot of work, and we all make and have made fallacious arguments in the past, because it's very easy to do. It's this intricate weaving of facts under the genesis of a major premise that then gets unpacked through the minor premises and inferred to a conclusion. It's a painstaking. I say that, debate is boring because even those basic overarching arguments are stated in fallacious terms. When I say fallacies, I'm referring to things like, affirming the consequent, hasty generalizations, the misuse of induction, the inability to tell the difference between a contingent and necessary truth, the inability to tell the difference between something that's necessary and something that's sufficient. There's so many elements here. Just basic, the concept of inference. The informal fallacies like, misleading vividness or bandwagoning or emotional reasoning, arguments to authority, equivocation. I mean, that's constant. That is everywhere. We all are guilty of it, sometimes without realizing it. But, you build an argument. You start off with a premise. That's when this is right off the bat, people fail miserably. Because a premise is an assumption. It's an assumption everyone believes it to be true. You can't even begin speaking unless you have a premise. It's an axiom, so to speak. It's a proposition that gives reasons and evidence, for accepting some other proposition drawn from it. And the conclusion, which is also a proposition, so to be established on the basis of the other propositions that derive, in fact, from the premise. Under the premise, you have the minor premises. These are specific elements. This is how you're unpacking the premise. These are supposed to be really in the premise, just you don't realize that. The point of argument really is to say that the premise contains implications that few people, non-specialists don't know about. These are the foundation of inferences, derived either empirically or rationalistically or deductively. And the difference between the two is that inductive reasoning is conventional and contingent, while the rationalist mentality, the deductive mentality, is formally true. It has to be true. Absolute truth, truth by definition, are deductive, assuming that the premise is true. But without a premise, everything else is just random observation, because unity comes before multiplicity. In a valid argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It's impossible for the premises of a valid argument to be true while the conclusions fall. But of course, this exists within a universe of meaning, a well-defined world. Terms have to be defined and agreed upon. Empirical truths are contingent. So when someone says science has proven X, Y, and Z, you laugh at them. So you don't even understand what contingent truths are. Science is, at its best, strictly an empirical set of observations. They try to minimize the number of axioms that they have. It's loaded with assumptions and crap like that, and most of it is garbage. If it was science 100 years ago, we laugh at today. But how many times does someone say science has proven something? Well, that's not possible. Science can suggest something, because it's not absolute truth and contingent truth. But contingency and non-contingency are formalities. Empirical thinking requires a large number of premises, including you have to assume that universal truths exist in the first place, or there's no point in doing anything. So a sound argument has true premises, clear terms, and the inferences make sense. They're fully explicable by the presented information, in both formal and in terms of its content. Now, why do I mention this? Well, first of all, it's not mentioned enough. We're living in a society where what I just laid out is Greek to most people. Media empires, politicians, professors especially, most clergy, they exist. Their entire world is based on people not knowing what a fallacy is. Equivocation is one of the nastiest. The occult sciences use equivocation a lot because they never use words in the normal sense of the term, but they're acting like they are. But our world is a living horror because humans can't reason. But what are the things that dominate people's thinking? Well, people are ruled by majorities, not wanting to be alone. They're ruled by media images that dictate what is real and what isn't, what's an acceptable opinion, what isn't. Social force, the demands for conformity. The most powerful for men, the sex drive, of course. Everything's driven by that. The desire to fit in, the desire to be liked, or some hang up like that. So you're in a crowded classroom in a university and race comes up, or the Jews come up. Well, the pressure on someone who knows the truth is immense. I've been there. It's a really horrible experience because if you tell the truth, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. But if you spout the lies for the sake of conformity, you're going to hate yourself. Well, this has everything to do with the fact that today is Tuesday, or 100 years ago, Tsar Martyrdom and his family were slaughtered. Slowly. Yurovsky stated that Anastasia, for example, was shot in the leg. And they drew out, especially the girls, drew out their deaths. Yurovsky was the worst one, screeching horrible curses in Yiddish at the family. Yurovsky, he told his bosses later on, well, I had to take all the girls' clothes off because I needed to make sure there weren't hidden jewels and gold in there. That's why I had to take the clothes off. Well, these people, quite explicitly, and Yurovsky makes no bones about this, they understood this, sacrificing someone or a group of people who are pure. And we know this, especially the girls, but the Tsar himself, as pure as a man can get, especially when compared to the crop of rulers today, to sacrifice someone that pure to Lucifer, Set, Prometheus, whatever, in exchange for power. And that was it. The last steel was broken. Now demons can rule openly. When a fact can be verified by the most cursory of observation, then it's probably true. Faulty reasoning exists not just because social pressures are great, but because reasoning itself is hard. Well, one of the concepts here, and the reason I need to talk about this, is that this dictates everything. The anger comes from the fact, as I've said, that you suffer over this stuff. You suffer over all of this, factual information in order to find out that people care about it. They just don't care about the truth of the matter. St. Philaret of Moscow, who probably more than anybody else laid out the theory of monarchy, especially in Russia. He says this, and this is my translation. St. Philaret says, true freedom is an active ability of a man, not enslaved by sin. So, in other words, he's free to choose the best course of action in the light of truth, the light of the truth of God, and to bring it to fruition with the help of grace, not just by his own power. Some people, in the name of freedom, an abstract freedom, want to understand the ability and unrestrained power to do whatever they want. This is a fantasy. And the dream isn't just ridiculous, but it's harmful. People like this don't know how to create anything. They don't know how to create anything solid. Suddenly new governments are being built according to their plans, but with equal suddenness they collapse. They introduce blind and brutal power of the popular crowd and the endless factional quarrels of those seeking power. They are seducers and claim to be leading them to freedom, but in fact, they lead them from that formal legal freedom to self-will that soon ends in oppression. This is actually a very simple point. And this is how to tell the difference between legitimate governments and fraudulent governments. Middle-class America is based on passion. Passion for gain, the worship for money, and the belief that money automatically brings status. In America, the middle class has always, and the poor even more so, define, a high income, define success as based in financial terms. Now, the final goal, of course, is sexual. And for men, attracting young and beautiful gold diggers is the reason that these guys function at all. Let's put it this way. If men were asexual, there would be no Armani suits. There'd be no Ferraris. Why would you buy a Ferrari for? There'd be no $400 cologne. There'd be no expensive shoes. There'd be no jewelry. There'd be no steroids, plastic surgery, or really any consumption above the most normal for life. Outside of industrial purposes, there would be no gold or diamonds. And men would be satisfied with little, and frankly, women would be reduced to irrational vehicles of procreation. Men are ruled by women, and they seek their favor at great cost to themselves. And this includes happily married men. Therefore, men are irrational and can't be trusted. It's not an accident that Tsar Nicholas stressed the beauty of the family and had to manifest it in the public sphere, and therefore was necessary for the Jews, Antichrist, to bring in Rasputin to cast doubts and hatred on that family. It was absolutely essential. Let me tell you something. There's one thing that one argument that the liberals have lost totally, and they admit that they've lost, is that a healthy family is the basis of all social good. Liberals accept this now. There are very, very few studies in sociology or politics that deny that. They've lost that argument, and they're aware that they've lost that argument. So what they do, instead of following that train of reasoning, which they can't do, they try to redefine the family. But let's be truthful, people are going to snicker at this. Men who are obsessed with this kind of thing, they deny it in frenzy gesticulation, but they know it's all true. And women are very angry when I talk like this because it threatens to expose their main source of social standing. But it doesn't matter if it's exposed or not. Men are still going to do it. Understand that this is what's called freedom today. This is, furthermore, the doctrine of the Orthodox Church. That's why I stress that it's from St. Philaret of Moscow, the great catechist. Middle-class life in America is not only not compatible with Christianity, but it actually derives from those who wanted to destroy it. What really did Adam Smith mean by the invisible hand? And why did he use that metaphor? Why did he call it invisible? He didn't imply anywhere else in his 1776 book that it was invisible, that's some mystical force. But why did he use that metaphor? Well, he's aware, being a utilitarian, that he's not referring to abstractions. He's talking about the rule of passions. Now, the sexual revolution hadn't occurred yet. We realize that markets really are about women. If a man were asexual, what would he look like? How would he dress? What would be his priorities? I'm telling you, and you know I'm right, that he would be unrecognizable. The sexual revolution was a way, and it just so happened that women end up ruling men just viciously with male cooperation. But it was to enslave man to the. It's a very simple idea, and I don't know why it takes so long for me to get through to people here. If you simply act arbitrarily, that is the very opposite of freedom. If you do whatever you want, why should I care? What's so good about what you want? How do you know what you want is good or bad? Most of the time what you want isn't good. And we're all guilty of this. What's so good about your choice? What are you basing your choice on? Your encyclopedic knowledge of the world? Family is utterly essential. People have yelled at me for talking about the sexual abuse of the girls. And I get it. I don't want to stress that point. But to defile the family was at the utter core of everything modern. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, even Rousseau, the so-called state of nature, there's only individuals. Who raises these people? And I feel stupid for when I first read them, they sounded plausible. Where did it come from? Hobbes talks about people just springing up out of the ground. It is so artificial to talk about an individual. It's laughable. So, if you have a society based on it, you're looking at institutionalized psychopathy. All right. That's absolutely necessary to understand a lot of this stuff. Building an argument, understanding evidence, the nature of the family, the murder of Tsar Nicholas, and the defiling of the family. This is absolutely essential. This is absolutely essential. And what the murder was, what it would mean to sacrifice something pure. And to be a sacrifice has to be a pure thing. You know, child abuse and the obsession of the elite with children comes from the fact that they're pure. Comes from the fact that they live more intuitive lives. They live better lives. As I've said many times, that the fall of man is recapitulated in puberty, which is exactly like as Genesis defines the fall. I need to say all this because what I've been reading from the regime's press today and yesterday, and what I generally read, as, the regime is a wounded animal man. When Tsar Nicholas was sacrificed to Lucifer, they thought that was it. And to a great extent, they were true, or they were right. Look at World War II. It's amazing. The fact that Europe survived World War II is a miracle. It never recovered, of course, because the best men were killed. Those are the people in the army. Now, the first thing I mentioned early on was that everything that the average educated person believes about history is a lie. I read, the reason that the Third Rome was such an angry book, and the reason I really wrote the book in the first place, is that I'm reading all these big survey histories of Russia. The 800-page big, from Vladimir to Putin. And the level of argumentation there is awful. Now, I don't know if they're just not capable of it, or they can't. In the early part of the century, as this was going on, the New York Times was taking press releases from the Bolsheviks, from Lenin, and reprinting them as if they were news. They absolutely threw every bit of journalistic ethics out of the way in order to simply report. Lenin would write a press release, and it would be put into the New York Times as if the New York Times wrote it. That's how bad it was. Let me give you an example. The Bloody Sunday shooting, 1905, 1906. There is no English language history, except of course from me, that understands what really happened. When I first read about the Bloody Sunday shootings, this was a allegedly loyal protest of workers carrying icons and pictures of the Tsar and singing songs. And out of nowhere and for no reason, Cossacks and guards in Petersburg opened fire and shot what initially was 5,000-10,000 people. Lenin said it was 5,000 people. He was nowhere near the place. And the New York Times published that without any, opposition. And so even today, they're just simply repeating Lenin's slogans. Well, it was only about 100 people were killed. Tsar Nicholas gave out of his own money for medical assistance And if someone was killed, he, from his personal funds, not from state funds, he compensated the victims' families 50,000 rubles each, which was a massive sum at the time. But as it turns out, this wasn't a peaceful protest. It's just that Lenin and Trotsky had worked for the New York Daily News at one point, the big New York paper other than the Times at the time, living in Brooklyn. They're just repeating this stuff. And historians really go by those articles. First of all, Tsar Nicholas was in the city at the time. None of them mention that he spent 50,000 rubles each. So 50,000 times 130. But it turns out that the churches in the area had reported break-ins, and the icons were stolen. There were some, useful idiots in the protest crowd, but that's not its purpose. It was meant to create a confrontation where people would be killed. Many members of the crowd were armed. There were no gun laws in Russia by any means. The icons were stolen and defaced after the fact. George Gapon was allegedly a priest who was Jewish. He was a fraud. Left the country, ended up working for the Bolsheviks later. The whole thing was a ruse. It was fraudulent. The other thing that was fraudulent was the Japanese war. Now, I'm not going to get into the war itself, but it wasn't a defeat for Russia. But the Jewish press in St. Petersburg simply invented whatever they wanted to hear. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are slaughtered by the Japanese. It's a huge defeat for Russia. And therefore, the royal system and the church are frauds. Now, you want to talk about non sequitur. Now, I've read these articles both in English and in Russian. That's what they say. They give no context. They don't explain the British control of all that. They're not even pretending to be able to create an argument here. The Russian Jewish press at the time say hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were slaughtered by the Japanese, who are so far superior to us militarily. Now, that's a premise. It was false. And unfortunately, I bought into that in the third row. The conclusion that they take from this, without really many propositions in between, they say, because of this, without context, without understanding, Tsar Nicholas needs to resign. Because of all this violence, Tsar Nicholas issued the October Manifesto, and it became part of the fundamental laws in 1906. So political parties were legalized, electoral institutions. They were complete frauds. There were no real political parties at all. The public ideology was totally different from what they really thought, etc. Created the Duma, which was elected within these parties. There was always representative bodies, but nothing like this. And I laugh when they say that the quote is the enlargement of the sphere of civil and religious liberties. But there was no any lack of press freedom, which was the worst thing that could have happened to Russia because of this irresponsible reporting. Now, in the third row, one of the things I'm very proud of is explaining the four Dumas and manipulation that American historians and British historians use in controlling this. Again, they're taking Trotsky's newspaper reports and reprinting them as if it's news. Now, I want to talk about something before I forget. Concerning the alleged abdication of Nicholas. You kind of have to, for much of this stuff, you have to read Russian. I taught myself Russian after grad school. My son was born, every time he learned a word in English, I learned the Russian word, and then I taught him. That's how I learned Russian. That's how I did it, and it was fun. But I had to do it, because once I learned it, a whole new world was open. Not knowing Russian, Ukrainian, you don't know anything. And I'm just embarrassed by how little I actually know. Now, Tsar Nicholas never abdicated the throne. It's a lie. First of all, it's forbidden by law anyway. One thing, there's Professor Alexander Nefontov at Kostroma State University, who argues that Tsar Nicholas wanted to become somewhat of a religious, almost patriarchal figure. and have Mikhail run the country as a political leader, as the emperor. Sort of a theocratic, like a Dalai Lama type. That's really what he wanted to do. And the arguments that the evidence that he puts forth is pretty impressive. Almost like when Alexander became Theodore Kuzmich, This is true. Because his view was the spiritual realm is really, understanding the foundation of natural law is an absolute necessity for any political thing whatsoever. The resignation letter itself is an obvious forgery. Now, none of us can find, the original is nowhere to be found. There's a lot here I've only learned in the last 5 years or so. Tsar Nicholas, remember, was a stickler for protocol. He was dedicated to the law, and he didn't cut corners. Ever. And yet, the resignation letter is not on official stationery. Now, the people who forged this thing, could they be, they're assuming that the ignorance was so overwhelming that it wouldn't matter. And of course, they were absolutely right. The two military men who wanted to take over and rule the country militarily, Mikhail Alexeyev and Alexander Lukomsky, wrote the thing and said later that they handed it to the Tsar to sign. This is not how imperial prescripts were accomplished. The thing is written by a typewriter. Now, I didn't know this until recently, but royal commands were always done in handwriting. And I think there's a good reason behind it. Because, a forgery can very easily be found, because handwriting is very specific. Oddly enough, it's addressed only to the military chief of staff. One of the most significant problems is that there's no official imperial seal on it. So most certainly, it's a forgery. And the signature, and this is very important, is not Nicholas's. If you look at it, it's a very bad, very unsteady tracing of a signature that comes from a 1915 order to the fleet. And it looks like, every little curve and detail is copied, but copied badly. It's a tracing. And, believe it or not, it's done in pencil. Which not only is illegal, but Tsar Nicholas made it a point because, when you do something in pencil, it can be erased and altered. The chief prosecutor of Crimea, a very, very beautiful woman, many of you know who she is. She's actually written a few articles saying that there is no way that Tsar Nicholas actually abdicated. She says none of the normal protocols have been followed. And for something this important, he was a stickler for these kind of details. Therefore, the thing is absolutely a fraud. She's the one who actually said the fact that it was done on a typewriter proves it's a fraud. Doing it on a typewriter is exactly why these things had to be handwritten, because if you can't write exactly like Nicholas can, don't try it, type it out and explain it some other way. And of course the press, immediately, reported it like it's Nicholas's, without asking any question. But even by themselves, any one of these is proof that the thing's a forgery. But it shows you how little academics and journalists knew about Russia that they accepted this without question. But one of the most important things, and I mentioned this in the third realm, I want to stress this here. The head of the Duma, Pavel Milukov, who's a little sleazy Mason, he admitted in his memoirs that Russia was doing too well. Russia was winning the war, especially after Nicholas took over. Germany was absolutely exhausted, at least in the east. Nicholas may have tried to make peace with his cousin Wilhelm, which would have been the end of England. Milukov says we needed to figure out a way to get rid of Nicholas fast. Because if he wins this war, if he signs a peace treaty with Germany and Germany then is able to take all of its forces in the east and crush the west, we are finished. Not only is he finished, but the left in general is finished. And the last thing that they could come up with, they couldn't shoot him. They simply didn't, the security was too great. The fake abdication letter was essential. It was not ideal. Had he won that war, the moral authority that Tsar Nicholas would have over the world would be extraordinary. It's like the defeat of Napoleon. The Tsar ruled Europe for a short time after that. The revolution would fail miserably. So a few things had to be done. Number one, they had to create fake letters. And number two, they had to tell the world that the war is lost. Russia doesn't have any supplies. The economy is collapsing. None of that is true. It's an old saw that supplies were collapsing all over the place. Russia didn't have enough rifles, ammunition. Well, that's true for everybody in the first months of the war. No one had any idea the war was going to be this bad. They had no clue. World War I was quantitatively and qualitatively a completely different set of events. But within a few months, it was all taken care of. But the press had to lie, just like it did in Japan. The Germans, as well as the revolutionaries, were dropping leaflets in the Russian trenches saying that the Tsar has ordered you to go back to your home villages because they're going to give you more free land, or words to that effect. But you need to leave now. The Tsar has abdicated, even though he didn't. The war's lost anyway. Go home, join the revolution, you'll get whatever you want, and you won't have to fight anymore. And by 1917, it was working. Now, soldiers at the front had pretty high morale, especially after the Germans were stopped, and Austria-Hungary was knocked out of the war entirely. Austria-Hungary's, much as I admire the monarchy there, after Nicholas I had reinstalled the monarchy in Vienna and saved the country, Austria's venom towards Russia was uncalled for, and their behavior towards Russians and Orthodoxy was absolutely outrageous, and they started World War I, there's no doubt in my mind. They are responsible. And they lost it. The reason why Germany had to split its forces was that they were depending, they had underestimated Russian power, like everyone else did, and they overestimated Austrian power. Because of all of this, the revolutionaries were panicking. And I mean panicking. If Nicholas makes any more victories, if he, the economy was growing even during the war in non-military ways. I have an article on this. Actually, it's just going to turn into a book. And the title is A Circle of Betrayal, Cowardice, and Deceit. That is a line that comes from Tsar Nicholas's diary. It comes straight from his diary because he knew that he was surrounded by deceivers and liars and frauds, both in the church and in the state. So the very crude fourth-rate forgery of the resignation letter was just, and they just depended on public ignorance, Western ignorance, and the desire of the press just to run, obviously it's a sensational story, the Tsar is leaving office. And so they could have just written it on a bubblegum wrapper and they would have been accepted. Actually, the press had spread rumors in the past that he had resigned even though he hadn't. They were dying for this story, was huge. They hated him anyway. So General Alexeyev and some of these other guys, they gambled that this really bad forgery, coloring book forgery, would be accepted. And to this day, it still is. But I title this book that because the church, the nobility had long since turned on Nicholas because the peasantry was doing very, very well. The peasantry owned the country. 100% of land in the east was owned by the peasantry. Depending on who you read, between 87 and 97% of the land in European Russia was owned directly by the peasants, and the nobles were simply dying as a social class. Now, when you read this elected Duma, they're screaming that we want to destroy the landlords and redistribute the land. Wait a minute. The landlords were the peasants. The nobles were losing out. Tsar Nicholas was lowering taxes. He canceled redemption payments, which is the price that peasants had to pay for the land after the liberation in 1861. He was doing too well. The church, the bishops Petrim, Agafango, Michael, even Andrei Vufa, one of my favorite new martyrs, unfortunately, and initially even St. Tikhon himself, did support the provisional government. And the provisional government installed Vian Lvov, who ruled the church. He was a Freemason. Of course, the one thing about both the Directory in Ukraine and the provisional state in Russia is that it was deeply Masonic. You had a huge number of bishops who were quite happy to see Nicholas go. One of the few that remained was Mikhail of Moscow, new martyr, and of course Anthony Papovitsky. This is what the Russian Synod said after Tsar Nicholas's resignation, alleged resignation. Now this is official policy now. The Synod issued this circular. The will of God has been accomplished. Russia has entered a new path of state life. May God bless our great homeland with happiness and glory on its new path. For the sake of the many sacrifices offered to win civil freedom, for the sake of the salvation of your own families, for the sake of the happiness of the homeland, abandon at this great historical moment all quarrels and disagreements. Unite in brotherly love for the good of Russia. Trust the provisional government. All together and everyone individually apply all your efforts to this end, that by your labors, exploits, and prayer and obedience, you may help it in its great work. This was official Synod policy. That was an official circular. It's like they had gone crazy. Metropolitan Vladimir, Archbishop Arsenia, they were organizing this, rewriting prayers to exclude prayers for the Tsar. But these men really technically were deposed because they had violated, number one, their oath of allegiance when they became bishops. They supported Republican Masonic principles. And, of course, there is the oath of 1613, which became part of Russian canon law and Russian civil law, which was the eternal obedience to the House of Romanov and the Russian Orthodox monarchy after the time of troubles. And this was when Mikhail was elected. The anathemas that were in Russian canon law and civil law for those insulting the king or not being royalists or wanting a republican state were simply removed from canon law. There was no synod meeting or anything. They simply crossed them out. Not so much for canonicity. They simply dropped them. It's really hard to sum up what's happening here. Russia in 1914 was, in my opinion, the single most prosperous nation in the world. Because not only did it have very high wages, it had a very low cost of living. But Tsar Nicholas saw himself as an example. I mentioned last time that after his murder, it was found that he had a fortune of 7 million rubles. That's been contested. There's another source that says it's 4 million rubles. In banks in London. That's, he was worried about revolutionaries. But much of it was spent. As I already said, his charity was overwhelming. When the war started, all the girls, the empress and the 4 daughters, well, except for the youngest, of course, and Barbara, the sisters and aunts of the royal family, all took a very intense crash course in nursing and immediately went to the front. The empress was given no special treatment. She was right there in field hospitals. And in fact, even the liberals admit that her heart was really giving out because she was sleeping like an hour a day. She was absolutely exhausted and she wouldn't stop. And she was paying for these things out of her own personal money. So they were broke, actually, by the end of the war. So all this garbage about the Tsar's fortune is a load of crap. When Trotsky was murdered, he was a billionaire in today's money. He had an account in New York and one in Switzerland. 100 times that of Tsar Nicholas. And again, none of this was ever reported anywhere. A few things about Russian society that doesn't get talked about. I mean, we all, we know about the massive industrial growth, the growth in labor productivity, the tremendous increases in yields. Russia was feeding the world. But crime in Russia was extremely low. The number of prisoners was very low. It was 1908, there were 56 prisoners per 100,000. In 1940, it was 1,214. In 1949, it was 1,537. It was a massive increase. Today in the United States, that figure is almost 800 per 100,000. So in 1908, it was 56 per 100,000 in prison. In Tsarist Russia today in the U.S., it's almost 800. It should also be noted that no petition of clemency was ever rejected by the Tsar, and he read these all personally. Try doing that to a president today, writing him a letter. You think he's going to read it? No. Tsar Nicholas read every request for clemency, and they were never ignored. Everyone says that Russia was a bureaucratic state under the late imperial era. Yet the number of government workers per 100,000 people in 1913 was 163. Today, in 2010, it's 1,153. There were more bureaucrats in the city of Paris than in the entire Russian Empire at the federal level. When the Kerensky state prepared the accusation, trying to build a case for treason, one of his allies, I can't remember who, had suggested that, well, we should publish in the newspapers the correspondence between Nicholas and the empress. And Kerensky said, if we were to do that, the people would recognize them as saints. Kerensky was in the process of being converted. So when, as I mentioned many times before, the inquest of the provisional government to try to find, and they had access to everything, trying to find corruption, to justify the revolution, they found absolutely nothing. There's a famous story that when the army issued new uniforms, they had a new pack design, things like that. Tsar Nicholas said, make sure it fit me for one. And he did a 20-mile march with a full pack, a typical issue pack, to make sure that it was suitable. During the war, of course, he was constantly at the front with his son. And in doing this, he was showing people that he wasn't afraid of anything. The Tsar took over the supreme command. The enemy didn't win a single inch of land. Something else. The percentage of citizens mobilized in Russia during the war was the lowest of all European states. So of all the men between 16 and 49, 39% were brought into military service at some level. In Germany, it was 81%, 74% in Austria, 80% in France, 50% in England, and 72% in Italy. So Russia was winning this war by 1915 with the lowest mobilization rate. I've mentioned many times in my books the Peasant Land Bank, which to me was one of the great victories of both Alexander III and Nicholas II. One of the reasons that the peasants owned almost every square inch of land in the country was because Nicholas controlled the currency. And in creating the peasant land banks, he was able to offer loans at zero interest or minimal interest, which, by the way, he'd end up canceling anyway, like he did with a lot of debts. And then he opened warehouses with agricultural equipment. And so you get able to supply sort of a co-op for free, agricultural machinery. The Soviets were never able to do anything like this. This is why Russia was feeding the planet, and the Soviet Union required American food aid from the day it was founded to 1980. And somehow he did this with the lowest taxes per person in Europe. France and Germany were 4 times more taxed. 2 times lower. In fact, France and Germany, 4 times lower than that of England. Yet wages were higher. And second highest in the world after the U.S. The cost of living was the lowest There was no inflation. Therefore, Russia was the world's most prosperous country. June 1903, this is before 1905, and one of the reasons they created these riots in 1905 is that Tsar Nicholas demanded of capitalists, you must pay benefits and pensions to injured workers. And that benefit has to be either, depending on how long they've been there, 50 to 66% of the original salary. Workers' unions were formed, but they were banned in the worker state of the USSR. And in 1912, mandatory insurance for workers, medical insurance, accident, etc., paid by the factory owner. William Taft, President Taft says, your emperor has created such perfect working labor legislation, no democratic state can boast of it. He said that to the Russian ambassador. All of this, in turn, is based on the currency. After the currency reform of 1897, gold was the foundation. The state and the emperor personally was its foundation, and it became the most stable currency in the world. Count Witte said, Russia's gold currency is under the control exclusively of the Emperor Nicholas II. So during the massive currency crisis of 1911-1912, Russia was totally unaffected. And that, in turn, led to Russia having the largest gold reserves in the world. And you see Putin following this policy today. It is the hardest currency, most stable currency, because it was non-convertible. But what people don't understand is industrialization is one thing, but labor productivity was higher than all of Western Europe. I mean, Russia was the world's main producer of most metals and grains. You had no inflation. You had almost zero unemployment. And something else I think you should know. Per capita alcohol consumption prior to the war was the lowest in Europe. It was the lowest in the world. Only Norway had a lower amount of alcohol consumption. As I said before, total freedom of speech, total freedom of the press. But because of this, you have no substantial economic problems. You have no substantial problems with crime. The number of mentally ill people per 100,000 in 1913 was 187. After 100 years of life without the Tsar, today in Russia, almost 6,000 people per 100,000. In the U.S. today, the number of visits to a doctor, physician's office, with a mental disorder being the primary diagnosis is 60 million people. This is unheard of. But this shows that a rational social life is central to mental health. The number of suicides per 100,000 people in 1912 was 4.4 per 100,000. In the U.S. today, it's almost 15 per 100,000. The Russian crime rate was the lowest on the planet. And at the meeting of the International Congress of Criminal Justice, which was in Switzerland in 1913, this was made very, very clear. Russian crime rate, this was simply the most prosperous nation on the planet. And it proves that Christian monarchy is very, very powerfully, it's a very powerful bit of evidence that Christian monarchy is the only legitimate government. An Orthodox man must be a monarchist. This is not an opinion. For one to believe in republican systems is to say that Christ brought truth to men and everything, well, except our social and economic life. That he didn't worry about. For centuries, economic elites had one obsession, and that's to opt out of the Christian social system, figuring out ways to have it not apply to them. Now, they succeeded with Protestantism, of course. Families, nations, communities, unions, these are natural creations. They're as natural as trees and animals. These aren't creations of men. These are aspects of natural law. Now, things like international community, the individual, the masses, the proletariat, these are not natural. They're the creations of men. They're the creations of sin. What we call American orthodoxy, I define as a desire of middle-class yuppies to have an authentic spiritual experience. They all tell you that they're attracted to the beauty of the liturgy, which I think is just a catch-all phrase. And yet, when it comes to Jews or usury, women, politics, they reject the church vehemently. The Russia of Tsar Nicholas II shows a nationalist, royalist, and state-centered politics that can sustain an empire, that could sustain tremendous prosperity, while still preserving basic egalitarian institutions like the peasant commune. So then how do we understand the murder of Tsar Nicholas? I think Archbishop Averki is the best person to go to here. Without talking about Antichrist, without talking about the release of demons from hell towards day-to-day life, it doesn't make sense. Averki says that these Jews had sold their soul, literally sold their souls to Satan, so as to conduct the most intense preparation for the speedy accession of Antichrist in the world. But they knew that the number one hindrance that stood in their way was the Tsar, but not just the Tsar, but a Tsar that rules over a huge, prosperous, growing, powerful Orthodox Russia that was almost completely autarkic. Now, Antichrist is the Kabbalistic conception of Adam Kadmon. The Khazars, Adam Kadmon, this is Antichrist. This is the Antichrist. The only way that Adam Kadmon can be brought to bear in the world is that Russia had to be destroyed. But it had to be destroyed symbolically. Those things that were destroyed in the basement exactly 100 years ago, the family, monarchy, innocence, female modesty. And they shot the dog. Was a dog a secret monarchist? I mean, that proves the symbolic, frenzied nature here. They shot the dog? Yurovsky was just shooting blindly. He couldn't even aim. He was so, our witnesses said he was just possessed. Yurovsky is the sickest of the bunch. So I'm going to close this two-part series on this extraordinary event. And I want you to listen. I don't care if you agree with me, you disagree with me, if I don't care. Man has a choice. Either oligarchy or monarchy. There is no in between. In other words, he has to choose between the common good, which is a real definition of freedom, and self-will, which is slavery to the passion. When Tsar Nicholas breathed his last breath, the Jews forced all humanity to choose the latter, oligarchy. Whether it be communist or capitalist, the ideology is exactly the same. To destroy Russia, it was necessary to destroy its soul, and that is the crown. To be a loving family man, that wasn't just a matter of his personal preference. He was making a statement. It was an icon of both political rule and the nature of social virtue. And it's no coincidence that it's exactly those virtues that both communists and capitalists despise. Modernity is one thing. It is based on the ritual of the killing of the king.